All right, let's dive in, shall we? Today, we're tackling a figure who really shook things up, reshaped China, left his mark on the entire 20th century. Mao Zedong.
Big topic.
It is, and we're going to be using this documentary transcript. It's called Mao's Red Terror in China from Free Documentary History on YouTube. They don't sugarcoat anything, I'll tell you that. Our goal is to, you know what, let's really uncover the how and the why, the key events, motivations, the impact of his rule.
And it all starts with his background. You know, he wasn't some political dynasty kid. He came from rural China, son of a farmer, actually, a pretty well-off farmer. It gives him a different perspective, right?
Farmer's son to leader of the most populous nation.
Right.
That's wild. But there's this interesting detail in the documentary. He struggled with foreign languages. Think about that. The man who basically, rewrote Marxism for China, he had trouble reading the original texts.
It really makes you think because, well, his version of Marxism, you know, it came through a very specific lens. He couldn't easily read the German, the Russian, so he relied on others' interpretations, stuff already adapted for Chinese audiences.
So he's already, right off the bat, shaping the ideology. And don't forget, China in the early 1900s, it was total chaos. A Qing dynasty gone, warlords everywhere, foreign powers still pulling strings. It was. They call it the century of humiliation, right? You can't understand Mao's rise without that context.
Totally. The documentary really emphasizes his strategic brilliance, especially during the Chinese Civil War, that long march. Forget just a retreat. That was propaganda genius.
It was a desperate escape, wasn't it? Running from the nationalists.
It was, but they turned it into this, heroic tale of the communists' will to survive. Mao used it to solidify his control of the party, create this narrative of, hey, we win even when we lose.
Songs, stories, they really crafted the narrative, didn't they? Turning a demoralizing defeat into this powerful symbol.
And that control over the story, that becomes classic Mao. He gets the power of symbols, storytelling, to win people over and to make his enemies look bad.
But by 1949, he's defeated the nationalists. There's that iconic image of him declaring the People's Republic of China right there in Tiananmen Square. Must feel like a brand new era for China.
Symbolically, huge moment. You know, the documentary really drives that home. The century of humiliation over, China's back on top, a powerful message for people who'd gone through decades of, instability, foreigners calling the shots.
And here's the thing, this triumph, it leads to something much darker. This documentary doesn't hold back. Instead of peace and prosperity, Mao's rule takes a really sinister turn. How'd that happen? How'd this liberator turn to such brutal tactics?
Well, this is where we see the, I guess you could say, chilling reality of Mao's vision for China. This transformation into a communist utopia, he thought, any opposition, real or imagined, had to be crushed. And so you get campaigns like the suppression of counter-revolutionaries.
Those execution quotas mentioned, just disturbing. Human lives reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet.
It wasn't about justice. It was about terror, enforcing total obedience, calculated brutality to silence anyone before they even speak up.
And this wasn't just a phase. This becomes like the defining characteristic of his rule, the shadow hanging over everything.
And that approach, as we'll see, had a devastating impact on China, especially as Mao starts his big social and economic experiments.
It's clear that, domestically, Mao wasn't shy about using force to get his way. But this documentary also gets into his ambitions, on the world stage. He comes across as a really, savvy player in the Cold War.
The fascinating part is how he managed to work with both the Soviets and the Americans, playing them off each other to help China. Real balancing act.
At first, though, it seems like he admired Stalin, saw the Soviet Union as, the model to follow.
On the surface, yeah. But you scratch a little deeper, and there's this clash of personalities, even ideologies. Stalin, he wants this global communist thing under his thumb. Mao, increasingly, sees China as an equal, maybe even a rival.
And that tension, it eventually explodes, right?
Oh, yeah. The Sino-Soviet split, it's in the documentary. This gradual process starts late 50s, almost leads to war in 69. There's a lot feeding into it. Mao, he didn't like Khrushchev's whole, moving away from Stalin thing, the idea of peaceful coexistence with the West. Plus, you've got border disputes, competition for influence within the communist world.
So personal rivalry, ideology, geopolitics, recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And for the whole global communist movement, the split, major blow. It divides the communist world, weakens them against the West.
They don't get into it too much in the documentary, but I wonder about other communist countries. Do they have to pick sides?
A lot of them did, which just caused more division. Some, like Albania, they sided with China, others stuck with the Soviets. This fracturing had long-lasting effects on world politics, really.
And this whole time, China is still trying to recover from the Great Leap Forward. Rough times.
Incredibly turbulent time, inside and out. But even with all that going on, Mao saw an opportunity in the Sino-Soviet split. China becomes like the anti-Soviet force, and he uses that to, start making nice with the U.S.
Leading up to Nixon's visit to China in '72, what a moment.
Huge turning point in the Cold War. The documentary makes that clear. Really smart diplomacy. And Zhu Enlai, the premier, he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Zhu comes across as a lot more practical than Mao, from what I saw in the documentary.
Totally. Mao, he's all about ideology, revolution. Zhu, he's a diplomat, a pragmatist. He gets that they need workable solutions, even if it means bending the ideology a bit. That was key to opening up to the West.
And that pragmatism, it went for their economic policies too, right?
Yeah, the documentary mentions this. China under Mao, communist in name, but they weren't afraid to, use capitalist methods when it suited them. They knew they needed economic growth, even if it meant bending the rules a little.
Interesting how they pulled that off, talking communism but playing the capitalist game.
It shows how complex China was under Mao. Ideology mattered, but so did power, economic progress. And this, like adapting, changing, that's something we still see today.
So by the time Mao dies in '76, he's completely changed China's place in the world.
But he leaves behind a complicated legacy, both good and bad, something people are still debating today. He unified China, brought it onto the world stage, but at a huge human cost, a cost we're still learning about.
It's heavy stuff. On one hand, incredible achievements. On the other, the horrors of the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the systematic use of terror. How do you even begin to, make sense of that?
That's the thing, right? To acknowledge the complexity, not just simplify it to heroes and villains. Mao, brilliant strategist, but ruthless dictator. His story makes us face these uncomfortable truths about power, about ideology, about what humans are capable of, good and bad.
And as we head into the last part of this deep dive, I'm really interested to see how his legacy continues to shape China today. We've gone from his, childhood on the farm all the way to his rise to power and all those turbulent years of his rule. What I'm really curious about now is how does his legacy, how does it still shape China today so long after he's gone?
It's a legacy that, well, it's both celebrated and debated, you could say. The documentary, it touches on this careful balance that the Chinese Communist Party, they still walk that line. They praise Mao, founder of modern China, the guy who brought them together, ended that, what they call the century of humiliation. But when it comes to, the darker stuff, the Great Leap Forward, all those who died, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, not so much.
Oh, it's like remembering the good, conveniently forgetting the bad, because that's one way to keep control of the story, even now. But how's that play out for people in China? Can they talk about the more controversial stuff?
It's complicated. I mean, Mao's picture, it's still up in Tiananmen Square on their money, but there's this ambiguity, openly criticizing him. That's still a sensitive topic, and the full extent of what his policies caused, the suffering, it's not really acknowledged. The documentary, it points out that this lack of, really dealing with the past, it's like a scar, hasn't healed properly.
It makes you think about what it must be like for people who lived through those times. The Cultural Revolution especially just seems so traumatic. They had those personal stories in the documentary, families ripped apart, neighbors turning on each other. Hard to imagine recovering from something like that.
It really speaks to the resilience of the Chinese people that they have, rebuilt, moved forward. But the Cultural Revolution, as the documentary suggests, it still affects them in subtle ways. Like how they view authority, if they even express dissent, even how they relate to each other.
Like a ghost that's still there, that fear and suspicion. So Mao might be gone, but his presence is still felt.
Absolutely, and that creates a problem for the leaders now. They have to recognize Mao's historical role, but they also have to deal with the baggage. It's a tricky balancing act, honoring the past, but also facing those difficult truths.
It really struck me, the documentary brings up this question of how any society deals with leaders who are both, admired and condemned.
Huh.
How do you weigh the good against the bad? That's something that goes beyond just China.
It does. It's a question for everyone, and one we always have to think about. How do we learn from history without simplifying it too much? How do we recognize that people, they can be capable of great things, but also terrible things?
This deep dive into Mao, I gotta say, it's given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And that's
Uh,
what's so great about exploring history, right? It makes you question things, it forces you to ask tough questions, and in the end, it helps us understand ourselves, understand the world better.
Well said. And to everyone listening, I encourage you, keep digging into this. Don't just take our word for it. Read different perspectives, form your own opinions. This is just the start, really. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.